Good evening, everybody. It looks like we almost have a full house, and I hope you've all got in and are starting to warm up from the chill of this evening. It's wonderful to see all of you here today. So good evening to colleagues, to friends, good evening to everyone online. I hope that you can hear us. Please don't panic. Professor Cyprian Broodbank, Director of the McDonald Institute, has not gotten shorter and more bearded over the evening. I am, in fact, Matt Davis. I'm the Deputy Director of the McDonald Institute, and I'm sadly stepping in tonight because Cyprian has tested positive for COVID. And Cyprian, I'm sure that you are watching online, and we wish you a speedy recovery. So, as I said, it falls to me to introduce our speaker for the 36th Annual McDonald Lecture, and that's a very pleasurable role for me. Professor Alfredo González Rubial is an archaeologist within the Institute of Heritage Sciences of the Spanish National Research Council. Alfredo has pioneered archaeologies of the contemporary past. I think he's radically redefined early post-processual forms of contemporary archaeology and drawn the spotlight away from the analysis of Western material culture and waste and towards larger critical narratives of colonialism, war, dictatorship, predatory capitalism, degradation, and forms of resistance and power. His work focuses on the accelerating excesses of globalization and what he terms supermodernity. And he's argued for archaeology to take a harder political stance in relation to these issues. Alfredo's work has been grounded in empirical studies with nomadic communities in the Horn of Africa and in work on the Spanish Civil War and the Franco dictatorship. Alfredo has a plethora of notable publications, including the Archaeology of the Spanish Civil War, an Archaeology of the Contemporary Era, which I believe is now on its second edition and has been newly updated just this year, and an Archaeology of Resistance, Materiality in Time in an African Borderland, which won the 2015 Society of Africanist Archaeologists Book Prize. Alfredo has also edited the collections Reclaiming Archaeology Beyond the Tropes of Modernity and Ethics and the Archaeology of Violence with Gabriel Mashenka. Alfredo is the managing editor of the Journal of Contemporary Archaeology and has held visiting professorial positions in Oslo, Copenhagen, Santiago de Chile, Minas Gerais, Stanford, and UCL. So it's a very impressive CV, Alfredo, and we are delighted that you've come to speak to us today. And I think that it's perhaps timely that we have Alfredo join us. So we are here in Cambridge, I think, reflecting hard on our positionality and practice as archaeologists, anthropologists, and heritage practitioners. Alfredo's work very much touches on this process, challenging us not only to consider our role within the discipline, but also the role of the discipline within the wider world and its recent past. So today, his lecture, which is entitled Modernity and the End of Globalization, I think in this, Alfredo is going to provoke us to question much of what we know about contemporary globalization. I think he's going to challenge us to see it as a non-linear process, and one that's not solely of increasing connectivity in the world, but actually that's one that has come to create the isolation of many formerly very heavily connected societies. And I think this is a really important reframing of globalization, one that places emphasis on better understanding the uneven effects of imperialism and capitalism today. So, Alfredo.
So first of all, I would like to thank the Institute of Archaeology for the invitation to talk here today. It's a really great honor. I have been looking at the previous lecturers, and there are so many people that I admire there. And I've seen that the last lecturer was David Wengrow, whom I know and whose work I admire. And some of the points that I'm going to make here are actually connected to some of his ideas and some of his recent work. And I would like to thank Matt also for the generous presentation. So I'm very happy to be able to share my research with you today. And I would like to talk about something on which I'm working at the moment. So this is work in progress. And sorry. So what I'm going to try to do here is to bring together two topics that have interested me for a very long time, from the beginning of my academic career some 25 years ago. So one of the things that have always interested me is long-distance trade and long-distance interaction in prehistoric times and in premodern times more generally. And this is something that I have studied in very different contexts, in Atlantic Europe and more recently in the Horn of Africa during the first millennium BCE, during the first and second millennia CE. And at the same time, I have always been very interested in the dark side of modernity, the calamities of modernity, including war, dictatorship, colonization, and so on. And I've always thought that these two issues were quite separated, that they had very little in common until relatively recently, when I discovered that there was actually a connection. So I cannot say that I always saw that there was a connection between these two separate themes and that at some point they would converge and that I was going to produce a synthesis of some sort. So it's something that has recently occurred to me that, in fact, there is a lot of connection between these two things. So what I would like to do here is to talk first about premodern forms of globalization, of long-distance forms of interaction and networking that could be considered globalization. And second, what I would like to do is to talk about the way modernity ended these forms of globalization, of long-distance interactions. And finally, I will focus on a specific region, on Africa, which I know relatively well because I've been working there for quite a long time, to illustrate these processes of deglobalization brought about by modernity and the European expansion. So premodern globalization, this seems perhaps a little bit odd to talk about globalization in a period before modernity, before the 15th century, when the world was not actually completely connected. So is it possible to talk about globalization for the pre-modern period? And what is the use of using this concept for the deep past? Well, if we talk about globalization only to refer to strict globalization, that is the intense integration of all the regions of the world, then we should only talk about globalization basically for the 20th and the 21st century. We cannot talk about globalization before the late 19th century. But perhaps we could use a more flexible concept of globalization, which I will define tentatively as any sort of sustained multi-actor, very long distance, actually intercontinental form of entanglement of or network of interactions. Now, I'm not alone, of course, in this interest on past globalizations. There has been quite a lot of interest in ancient, medieval, and even prehistoric globalization for the last 15 years or so, and there are many different reasons for this renewed interest in very long distance connections in the past. We have archaeometry, the proliferation and popularization of archaeometric methods during the last 30 years that have changed our ideas or notions or assumptions about mobility. We now know that people were moving more and across longer distances in the past than we used to believe. But there are also theoretical reasons for this interest in mobility and diffusion and networks. We have post-colonial theory and decolonial theory and the interest in empires, imperialism, and colonial systems. We have neo-diffusionism, which itself is influenced by these, what Christian Christiansen calls the third scientific revolution, globalization theory, network theory. So there are many theoretical reasons for this interest in globalization these days. But we can find the precedent to this interest in globalization in the 1990s. At that time, it was world systems theory rather than globalization that was the key term. It was the lens through which this interactions and networks were being studied. We have, in 1993, there were two papers that were published, one by Andergunde Frank and the other by Andrew Sherratt on Bronze Age world systems. And what they were doing was basically applying this world system theory made famous by Immanuel Wallerstein in the 1970s to the deep past. So the idea is that these world systems were not something of modernity, not even of the Middle Ages, but something that already existed in prehistory, in later prehistory. And they were interested in the circulation of technologies, of commodities, materials, and so on. So the focus was very much on politics and economics. This was later expanded by, among others, Christian Christiansen, and his book with Thomas Larsson, The Rise of Bronze Age Society. They explore travels, but also the diffusion and the circulation, not just of goods, commodities, and so on, but also of myths and stories, cultural elements across vast territories. And one of the examples that Christian Christiansen has used very often is that of the twin gods that appears in Bronze Age Scandinavia, in the Levant, and even in India. Now, at the same time, the archaeometric revolution allowed us to better assess the importance of the movement, not just of people, but also of plants and animals through very vast distances. So we have, for example, the work of Dorian Fuller, the work of Nicole Vauban, studying these translocations of animals and plants through very long distances from Africa to South Asia and across Eurasia. By the 2010s, archaeologists were explicitly using the word globalization to describe these processes. So it was no longer world systems, but globalization. And we have these two books, Tamar Hodo's Archaeology and Globalization, published in 2016, and then Globalization in Prehistory, edited by Nicole Vauban and Michael Fracchetti in 2018. Where they are applying this concept of globalization to the deep past, to prehistory, ancient times, and so on. The book of Boivin and Fracchetti is particularly interesting in the way they frame premodern globalization, because they call attention to spaces that are non-urban, non-state, which is a break with the tradition of studying globalization as something that is basically led by urban centers, by state formations, empires, and so on, and so on. These have been the main characters in narratives of globalization, but also of long-distance trade and long-distance interactions. So they say that we have to pay more attention to what are usually considered marginal actors, but who are not. They are not marginal actors, but marginalized actors. Nomads, hunter-gatherers, peddlers, pirates, forager traders. It is not just that they are key in having access to basic resources that are then circulated in these global systems. It is also that they have the knowledge, the skills to extract these resources and put them in circulation. And the thing is that they were not perceived as marginal actors in the past, but they were very much on an equal footing with states and empires. And I will return to this later. They also emphasize the multi-ethnic melange that characterizes many of these early globalizations. And I would say that more than multi-ethnic melanges, what we have is multicultural melanges. It is very different peoples participating in these systems in a rather symmetric way. People that have different religions, people that have different political organizations. And this wide variety of cultures and identities implies a certain form of cosmopolitanism, of tolerance, that is also characteristic of these premodern forms of globalization. And finally, they talk about the continuities between premodern and modern globalization, which has not to be understood as a linear thing between the past and the past being more simple than the present, or a process of increased globalization. I would like to mention two examples of premodern globalization that I find particularly interesting, because these are regions or continents that are usually considered unglobalized, so not that much part of these global networks. I mean, if we think about globalization in the past, probably Eurasia comes to mind, because it is an area that we know it has always been deeply connected. But Africa and the Americas look like, well, quite isolated. In the case of Africa, there has been a lot of interest in these forms of globalization, of pre-modern globalization, for quite some time. Most of the work has focused on Eastern Africa, which was, of course, connected through the Indian Ocean with other regions of the world. But this was not the only region that was connected. Some authors have stressed these forms of African globalization. We have the book by Peter Mitchell in 2005. In Tamar Hodo's book, there are contributions by Paul Lane and Scott McEachern about African globalization. And more recently, we have this book by Christopher Ehret, who is himself a linguist, Ancient Africa, A Global History. What Ehret does is emphasizing, on the one hand, the connection of Africa with the rest of the world, the synchronicity of Africa, of cultural, political, and economic processes in Africa with similar processes elsewhere in the world, which means that there was some connection. And on the other hand, he emphasizes the contributions of Africa to the rest of the world, which is important because we tend to see Africa as a backward area that receives but does not contribute, and he tries to reverse that. And I would like to mention a couple of examples of this pre-modern globalization of Africa that are perhaps not as well known as, well, the case of Northeast Africa, Egypt, or the Swahili coast in East Africa. And one of them is the pre-medieval trans-Saharan trade. Trans-Saharan trade during the medieval and post-medieval period is relatively well known, and it's I mean, outside academia. So we know that there was these caravanas crossing the Sahara and reaching the Sahel and Western Africa. But until the 1980s or so, it was thought that this Saharan trade actually initiated in the late first millennium CE with expansion of Islam. And before that, there was no proper trans-Saharan networks. So it was believed that it was almost a myth. There is a paper in the 1970s calling this ancient trans-Saharan trade a myth. Well, we now know that it is not a myth, and we have plenty of data to support the existence of a pre-medieval, pre-Islamic trans-Saharan trade in Africa. There is this site in Burkina Faso that was excavated a couple of decades ago, Kisi, which has delivered lots of glass beads coming from India, coming from Mesopotamia, coming from the Mediterranean. And this site is from the first half of the first millennium CE, that is well before the arrival of Islam and the expansion of the medieval networks. The bronze, the metal that was used for bronze armlets and bracelets, the tin that was used to making this bronze came from the Mediterranean, probably from Spain and from Sardinia. And we have swords and daggers whose typology clearly relates to similar artifacts in the Mediterranean, in North Africa, or in Europe. So this trans-Saharan trade existed well before the Middle Ages, and it was probably very, very old. And it could go back to the third millennium BCE, if not before. We have, for example, the ivory trade in the Western Mediterranean, in the Iberian Peninsula, that is known for the third millennium BC. The Chalcolithic period, we have found lots of hypo-ivory, elephant ivory. And the interesting thing is that this ivory probably did not come from Northern Africa, because when it has been analyzed, in many cases, these were savanna elephants. So they came from south of the Sahara, most likely. So they could have come from the south of the Sahara in Western Africa. Now, my other example is Black Death. So when we see maps of the Black Death the spread of the Black Death. They usually show the spread of the disease from Eastern Asia into Europe and North Africa. And usually sub-Saharan Africa is not in the picture, which may lead us to believe that Africa was not affected, sub-Saharan Africa was not affected by plague. But there are some archaeologists that believe that this is not the case. We have the work of Gérard Chouin, who believes that several phenomena that happened in Africa during the 14th century and the 15th century can be related to the spread of the Black Death. For example, the disappearance of certain funerary traditions in Senegal and Gambia during the 14th century, 15th century, the reduction or the collapse of cities in southern Nigeria, the disappearance of the glass bead industry in the city of Ife, the disappearance of specialized crafts are probably related to the arrival of the Black Death to West Africa. And on the other side of the continent, in the Horn of Africa, it is very interesting that during this period, amulets start to proliferate. Amulets that were used to protect people against evil eye, against disease, against evil spirits. And also, it is attested that for the first time, the cult of Saint Roch appears in Ethiopia. And Saint Roch is a saint that became popular in Europe during the 14th and 15th century as a protector against plague. So if the Black Death actually had an impact all over Africa, even in West Africa and Central Africa, this is because Africa was globalized at the moment. It was well connected with the rest of the world. And the other continent is America, or the Americas, which of course in this case we cannot say that it is in connection with other continents, or not that much, except for the Vikings in Vinland. But if we use a more flexible concept of globalization, we could perhaps include the Americas here, because during the first and second millennium CE, we see that the Americas were deeply connected, very intensely connected. And I would like to mention here Tim Pocketat's recent book, Gods of Thunder, which is fascinating. He talks about the American Middle Ages between the late first millennium CE and the mid-second millennium, before the arrival of the European conquerors. And he sees similar processes happening across Central America, Mesoamerica, and North America. And more specifically, the spread of the cult to the gods of wind and rain and thunder. So he relates that to climate change. Climate became drier during this period. There were very intense droughts that are related, for example, to Maya collapse. And these cults are related to this situation, to this climate change. But the important point is that these cases, these cults, did not emerge. It's not a case of cultural convergence, that people were doing similar things in similar places because they were subjected to the same climate crisis. It is that these cults spread throughout the Americas. They were taken by missionaries, by pilgrims, by traders. So this means that this pre-Columbian world was deeply connected from Central America to the northeastern part of the United States. So going back to the definition of premodern globalization, we can perhaps be a little bit more specific here. So I think that it's important to distinguish between globalization and long-distance trade or long-distance interactions. And when I'm talking about globalization, I'm referring to relations that are really large scale, that connect different continents, or at least land masses with radically different ecosystems. So, for example, the Hanseatic trade in the late Middle Ages was regional trade and long-distance trade, but it was not globalization if we compare that to the Indian Ocean trade during the same period. So the scale is completely different. The kind of factors that are involved are completely different. The ecosystems that are involved are also completely different. Now, there has to be some sort of institutionalization for us to talk about globalization. These have to be contexts that are sustained through time. It cannot be, just a weird object that appears very far from the source of origin. So it has to be trade or relations that are sustained through time, which means also that there has to be a social awareness of the system. People have to know that this system exists. So the people in Central America have to be aware that this call to the thunder gods is not something local, but is something that is connecting very far away places. People have to be aware of the roots of the people that are involved. Of course, they don't have to have a very specific knowledge of all the actors that are involved. And the knowledge varies from one person to another. It's not the same a peasant and a merchant and a pilgrim, right? But there has to be at least some general knowledge that this system is in place. Then it has to be a multipolar system. It's not just two groups that are interacting, but several collectives that are interacting. And this includes also collectives that are in themselves heterogeneous and multiple, that are including all sorts of both human and non-human agents. And finally, we have travel. So people have to move so that we can talk about globalization. It cannot be just simply ideas moving around. It cannot be just commodities that circulate through indirect trade. There has to be people moving around, merchants or pilgrims or preachers, missionaries, and so on. So what happens when the Europeans start to expand from the late 15th century onwards? From an archaeological point of view, we change from prehistoric, medieval, or ancient archaeology to historical and contemporary archaeology. And historical archaeology, especially in the American version, has always been characterized as the archaeology of the modern world, the archaeology of the European expansion of capitalism and colonialism. There are, of course, other kinds of historical archaeologies, like African historical archaeology, that largely bypasses this European expansion. But in general, when we talk about historical archaeology, we talk about the West encompassing others, about the West incorporating other regions, other peoples, other ecosystems into a global system. And it makes sense that archaeologists understand this modern period in this way, because this is what archaeologists document archaeologically, right? When you go to a site of the 16th century or the 17th century, no matter where in the world, you find these items that are related to the European expansion. It can be crossbow bolts, it can be majolicas, it can be coins, but they are usually read as the integration of this site or this region into this global order established by the Europeans. But something that we do not consider that often is how the West isolates other peoples. And this is something that occurs consistently from the late 15th century onwards. And I think that we should pay more attention to the production of isolation, to the political economy of remoteness. And there are plenty of examples for that. Returning to the Americas, consider, for instance, the case of South America. Here we have two very well-defined regions in archaeological terms. We have the Andes, and then we have the lowlands, the Amazonian lowlands. They are studied by different specialists. And of course, we have always known that there were relations between the Andes and the lowlands and the Amazonian lowlands. But we were not aware of the intensity of such connections until relatively recently, when, thanks to, unfortunately, the deforestation of the Amazon and the use of LiDAR, we have been starting to document these urban centers in the middle of the forest, which prove that the territory that is now occupied by the Amazon forest was densely settled, and there were many complex societies. There were sanctuaries, there were urban centers, there were roads. And this world was actually not that different from the world of the Andes in many ways, so from the cultural process in the Andes. And these worlds were clearly more connected than we had supposed. What the arrival of the Europeans from the early 16th century onwards meant was the production of isolation. Many groups there was the demographic collapse, and then Many groups abandoned these urban settlements. They abandoned agriculture altogether. They became hunter-gatherers. They isolated from each other. And this is an ongoing process. So it's not something from 500 years ago, but it's something that still happens today. We still have uncontacted indigenous groups, which are groups that have been cut off from their own forms of globalization and long-distance networks, and that have systematically refused to engage, to participate in this modern form of globalization in which they have everything to lose. The case of North America, which is better known, is similar. Right? Similar processes of fragmentation, of isolation, of decomplexification, the abandonment of agriculture, and so on. And a very interesting case is that of the Southern Pacific. We know that the Southern Pacific was a deeply networked area by necessity, because it's all about islands and archipelagos and so on. So we know that at least from 3,000 years ago, people were moving around, that they had these very complex systems, the most famous of which is the Kula system that existed until the 20th century. But similar trading networks and interaction networks existed in the past, in the deep past and in the recent past. And probably many of these systems, they were disassembled during the 16th and the 17th century, that is before the onset of European colonization in the late 18th century. How is that possible? It is possible because Europeans were visiting the Southern Pacific in the 16th century and the 17th century. We have Spaniards, we have Portuguese, then we have the Dutch sailing through these seas, contacting the islanders in different places. And we know that these had an effect because they were transporting with them, they were transporting plants, they were transporting animals like rats, and they were transporting pathogens. So the presence of the Europeans in the Southern Pacific probably created a demographic collapse similar to that of the Americas. The problem is that since they didn't settle in the islands, it is very difficult to track the impact of the arrival of pathogens there. But we have people like Maria Cruz Berrocal, a colleague at the Incipit, who is trying to assess this impact from a cultural point of view, an economic point of view, and a demographic point of view. And in some cases, we can assess this early pre-colonial impact of the Europeans in local societies. For example, in the case of Futuna and Alofi, these islands were visited by Spaniards in the early 17th century, and they say that there were some 10,000 people living in these two islands. And archaeology confirms that because there are plenty of archaeological remains for this period of terraces and sanctuaries and houses and what have you. Now, when the Spaniards returned during the early 18th century, there were just 800 people living in Futuna and nobody in Alofi, which remained deserted until these days. And the people that survived in Futuna, they had abandoned their previous social organization. It was no longer a chiefdom. It was no longer a ranked society. It was way more organized along way more anarchic lines, which is quite surprising in an area where there are so many chiefdoms. This was the result of this early colonial contact, so to say. So it's obvious that if the arrival of the Europeans was creating such an impact in the demography and the society of these people, it is obvious that it probably collaborated to the destruction of the local networks or local forms of globalization that they had. So it's the modern process of globalization or deglobalization. Well, it's both. The thing is, or the problem is that we have paid too much attention to the globalizing process because it's pretty obvious, right, that now the Americas and Europe and Africa are connected through the Atlantic trade, for instance, or that the Americas are colonized by Europeans. But the problem is that we have forgotten about the deglobalization processes that were at least as important as these processes of globalization and interaction and connection. And historical archaeologists are so used to this globalization paradigm or this paradigm of connection that they even find it in places that should be associated, if anything, to isolation and remoteness and deglobalization, like, for example, maroon sites. Of course, maroon sites are associated to globalization in the sense that it is fugitive slaves from Africa that are living in these isolated places in America. But the places themselves, they are isolated. These were people that cut themselves off from this global system, in which they were, of course, they occupy the lower ranks of this global system. So this, for me, it's more a case of deglobalization than the other way around. So I will focus now more specifically on the case of Africa, where you can see these processes of the globalization more clearly at work. The image here is Gambier in southern Benin. It's one of several lake villages that emerged around the 17th century as a response to slave trading and slave raids. Africa was, of course, involved in these new networks that emerged from the late 15th century. We have new cultigens arriving in Africa, such as corn or tobacco. We have manufacturers, European manufacturers arriving in Africa. And we have the slave trade, which had a tremendous impact and a very lasting impact throughout the continent. But the thing is that archaeologists, historical archaeologists in Africa, they have put a lot of emphasis on coastal sites, on sites of trade, and on trading materials, such as glass beads, which are European imports mostly. And they haven't paid that much attention to inland sites, indigenous settlements, and regional networks. So what happens if we look at these other things instead of sites of mobility, connection, and interaction? Well, we see on the one hand a lot of people fleeing globalization, escaping these new networks and isolating themselves willingly. An example, the Koinadugu Plateau in Sierra Leone. So here we have these large settlements, large agglomerations that appear in the 18th century, 19th century. These are cities in many ways, up to 10,000 people. But interestingly, they were not part of a state. Actually, these people were escaping the state, the slaving estates that were proliferating in the area. So they were organized in a more hierarchical way with different collectives, rotatory chiefs, secret groups, and so on that were participating in the organization of these villages, of these towns. And more importantly, when archaeological surveys have been conducted in these places, they have not found virtually any imported elements that come from the European trade, except firearms, but nothing else. And we have textual evidence for the mid-19th century of travelers saying, don't go to the Koinadugu Plateau because people there, they don't want to trade, they are dangerous. So these are people that are escaping this form of globalization that was the Atlantic trade and the slave trade. An even more radical case is that of the island of Bioko. The island in the Gulf of Guinea. The island was settled in the mid-first millennium CE by the Bubi people. And they didn't have a lot of connection with the people of the mainland. They were not interested in what was going on during the late Iron Age in Central Africa, which was, among other things, social inequalities growing, the establishment of chiefdoms, and so on. So they went to this island and they kept this egalitarian form of organization. Now, when Europeans arrived in the 16th century, they refused to enter into the Atlantic trade. And we have, in this case, we have plenty of evidence, year after year, of travelers and merchants saying, do not go to Bioko because these people are savages, they are violent, they don't want to trade with us, they are not going to sell you people. So they managed to stay out of this globalized, new, modern globalized order for some 3 centuries. And even in the late 19th century, they were using a Stone Age technology. It was only during the second half of the 19th century when iron, already under Spanish colonization, when they started to use metal tools in a more or less frequent way. In other cases, what we have is not so much people escaping globalization or trying to avoid the worst of globalization, but people that were simply cut off from globalization. And we have, for example, the case of Banda in Ghana that have been well studied for many years by Anne Stahl and later by Amanda Logan. And what we see here is a region that was very well connected in the Middle Ages, that had a very strong regional and long-distance trade. The site is not far from Bego, which was a multicultural, multi-ethnic community that was heavily involved in the trans-Saharan trade during the Middle Ages and down to the 17th century. And now from the late 18th century, when this part of Africa became theoretically more globalized, we see that we have less imports in this place, which means that this place is less connected to the rest of the world than it used to be in the Middle Ages. And it's significantly reduced under British colonization in the late 19th century. And at the same time, regional networks are debilitated, they are weakened. And this had a very important consequences for the people of Banda. On the one hand, one thing they acquire from this new global system is new crops, so they introduce corn. And the problem is that corn is not so drought resistant as millet and other local cultigens. So they are more exposed to famines. And at the same time, when there is drought and they don't have enough food, since they do not participate that much in the suprarregional trade, they don't have any source of income, which allows them to obtain food. So this is the reason why no famine is attested in this part of Africa before the late 18th century. And there are many other cases. Another example is in the Tsavo Park in Kenya. There is widespread settlement abandonment during the last few hundred years, and a reduction of imported materials and a weakening of interregional trade. And we could go on and on. But I would like to finish with one further example, the Horn of Africa, which I know well because this is the area where I've been working for the last 25 years. And the Horn of Africa is a globalized region by definition because of its location in between Arabia, Africa, the Mediterranean, India, and so on. So it's in the middle of everything. And it has many key resources, things that were very valuable in the past, some of them are still in the present, gold, ivory, wild skins, incense, and so on. So this is a case of deep time globalization. We know that the Horn of Africa was well connected at least from the 3rd millennium BCE, and we know that it was regularly visited by Egyptians from the mid-2nd millennium. We have actually the remains of the ships in Egypt that were sailing to the Horn of Africa. We now know that there was a trade in baboons from the Horn of Africa to Egypt. Some Egyptian pottery has been found in the area of northeastern Sudan, next to Eritrea and Ethiopia. And there are other materials in Eritrea, in Matara, that are probably related to this Egyptian trade. Now, this trade continued in different ways throughout the 1st millennium BC. And during the 1st millennium CE, we have a trading state, a trading kingdom, which was the kingdom of Aksum, that was in contact with the Roman Empire, the Parthian Empire, India, and so on, and whose political economy relied heavily on these long-distance trading connections. Now, the thing is that it was not just these states that were participating in long-distance trade and in these interactions, but also non-state actors, such as nomadic pastoralists. And this is one of the things I have been studying for the last 7 or 8 years in Somaliland and Djibouti more recently. We have excavated places like the cemetery of His in eastern Somaliland, a place that was known since the late 19th century because some Roman pottery appeared there. We returned to the site, we mapped the entire necropolis, we excavated some of the tombs, and we documented lots of materials on the surface. There were Roman pottery from central Italy, from southern France. There was Indian materials from Arabia. So It was really a cosmopolitan entrepot. The perfume bottle here comes from Roman Syria. It was found in one of the tombs that we excavated, and it's dated in the 3rd century CE. To give you an idea of the extent of global integration of these people here, of these nomads, we have this glass vessel, a honeycomb pattern vessel, which is very typical of the 4th and 5th century CE in the Roman Empire. We found one of these vessels in one of the cairns that we studied, that we excavated in Djibouti, and a very similar vessel appeared in Korea in the tombs of the Silla dynasty of the 5th century CE. So this is, I mean, to call this globalization is not that, it's not an exaggeration, I would say. Now these global networks were connected to regional networks that we do not know that well, but we are now starting to document. So often when we think about these long-distance trade and these interactions, we think about the coast, about different coastal areas that are in connection, but these connections spread further inland. In the case of the Horn of Africa, several hundred kilometers. So we are now tracing these through local materials that appear from the coast to the rift lakes, which are some 1,000 kilometers from Djibouti or the coast of Somaliland. After the collapse of Aksum in the 7th century, it is often assumed that this was associated to a collapse in this global system of interaction across the Indian Ocean. But what actually happened is that it was no longer the Aksumite state that was the main actor in these long-distance networks, but the nomads of the Eastern Horn of Africa that were the main characters. And this explains why during the Middle Ages, and especially from the 11th century onwards, we see eastern Ethiopia, Somaliland and Djibouti, all the eastern part of the Horn flourishing, and cities emerge. There is a very intense trade in all kinds of things with India, with China, with Southeast Asia, which reached their apex during the 15th century and the early 16th century. And then something happens. The entire system collapses during the 16th century. And there are several reasons for that. On the one hand, there are endogenous elements, there are local reasons for that. The war between the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia and the Sultanate of Adal in the eastern part of the Horn. It was a devastating war. But before that, we have the blockade of the Portuguese who have arrived in the Indian Ocean just a few years before. They established a blockade of the Red Sea, and for 50 years it is very difficult for the ships coming from the Indian Ocean to reach the coast of Ethiopia and Southern Arabia. Now the connections with Southern Arabia resume, but in the case of the Northern Horn, they are basically disarticulated. They never recover from this blockade and from the local crisis. So there is a generalized systemic collapse across the Horn, which is manifested in generalized deurbanization. Cities disappear everywhere. We have documented dozens of abandoned cities. People return to nomadism. So instead of cities, what we will have are campsites. The amount of imported materials diminishes dramatically. In this graph, you can see how from the 16th century to the 17th century imports collapse. And the collapse is actually greater than you can see there, because here I'm putting together all the imports in Somaliland from the 17th to the 19th century, but from the early 19th century, the trade recovers a little bit. We see that many towns are replaced, that were located in open places, in plains and so on. They are replaced by small villages in naturally defended places. And then we have the case of Ethiopia, which is different. It gets cut off from this globalization of the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. But here we have also a willing rejection of globalization. And this has to do with the traumatic experience of the Jesuit mission in the country during the late 16th century and the early 17th century that ended in a civil war in the country. So after 1629, the Ethiopian kingdom decides that they don't want to do anything to do with Europe, with the rest of the world, because there are some connections with India and Egypt and so on. But they are basically cut off from the rest of the world in many ways. So Ethiopia is willingly isolated from the rest of the world. The old Sultanate of Adal is cut off from globalization violently by the European arrival in the Indian Ocean. And this is not something that is exclusive of the Horn of Africa. In other parts of Eastern Africa, the Swahili coast, you can see that some cities collapse or disappear, or the trade diminishes. It is not generalized. There are other places, other towns that do well during this period, but in many other cases, like Kilwa, you see that in the 16th century they enter marked decline. Mogadishu a little bit later in the 17th century. And this, the cosmopolitan system of trade and interaction that existed during the Middle Ages is replaced by a militarized form of trade that is introduced by the Europeans, by the first by the Portuguese, then by the Dutch, and which is manifested in the many forts that start to proliferate along the African coast. So what we have in Africa, perhaps more clearly than in other territories, is a great process of globalization that affected very large areas of the continent between the late 15th century and the late 19th century. And I think that we have to put more emphasis on this deglobalization to understand, among other things, the cultures that colonial administrators, archaeologists, and anthropologists found in the late 19th century, when the colonization of the central parts of Africa started, and they started to find all these very primitive, isolated groups inside the continent. Well, they were the product of this deglobalization process that had started in the late 15th century. So one of the things that is interesting about using the concept of globalization to understand these large networks of interaction in the premodern periods is that it allows us to compare with modern globalization and to see the differences. And in the case of premodern globalizations, we can say that what was at work was what David Graeber called human economies. According to Graeber, human economies are those economies that are interested in reconfiguring relations between things and not so much about the circulation of commodities. Well, premodern globalizations are, of course, about the circulation of commodities, but they are also about the circulation of people, the reorganization of relations between people. And you see that in most cases, we have people establishing social relations. It's not just about trade. And people like the Swahili, which are, by definition, hybrid people, the product of cultural bricolage, but also of mixed skin, is a good example of these human economies at play. In the case of modern globalization, we have predatory economies, we have extractive economies in most of these places. Not so much, of course, human economies, which are actually destroyed through this process. We have multipolarity. This is something that is very obvious in the Indian Ocean, whereas in the case of modern globalization, we have a tendency to establish monopolies. It's never achieved, virtually never achieved, but the tendency is to appropriate these systems, these global systems, by just one actor. This was the idea of the Portuguese when they arrived into the Indian Ocean. They wanted to take hold of the entire system. They could not understand that there were that many actors and there was no one that was more prominent than others. And in all cases, these premodern forms of globalization are highly ritualized. And I'm talking about social ritual, but also about religious rituals. And this is something that occurs all over the world, how ritual is a way of guaranteeing these interactions between people that are very different and that often have very different religions. And against that, from the late 15th century onwards, we have a form of mediation that is very often militarized. It's gunboats, it's forts, through which trade is conducted. It's no longer sanctuaries, it's no longer open markets of fairs. It's the fort, it's the gunboat, the element that articulates trade. Then in premodern globalization, we have symmetry, different actors, very different actors, hunter-gatherers and estate agents, participating more or less on an equal footing, versus the hierarchical globalization characteristic of the late 15th century onwards. And in premodern globalization, we have what could be called vernacular forms of cosmopolitanism, in which many different peoples participate. So these were peoples that are aware of different forms of thinking, of different forms of social organization, and they respect these other forms of social organization. They are aware that they exist. They might introduce these new ways of thinking or new ways of organizing themselves or not, but they respect. It's possible to participate in this system from very different social, religious, and so on perspectives. And versus this form of vernacular cosmopolitanism, we have the cosmopolitanism of the elites and the ideologies of superiority that become particularly common and widespread from the late 18th century onwards. So to conclude, I think that it's important to reassess the relevance of premodern globalization and to link these different processes of globalization, to understand that many of them were actually connected, to bridge the gap between premodern and modern globalization, to better understand both. This doesn't mean that we have to accept a linear narrative. Actually, the process is way more complex, with moments of collapse of globalization and intensification of globalization. If we adopt this perspective, we inevitably provincialize Europe, which now has such a leading role in our understanding of globalization. But actually, the leading role is only true for the last 300 years or so, not for the previous 3 million years. And the most important point, I guess, in this talk is the need to visualize modern deglobalizations, to see the last 500 years as a huge process of disconnection and the production of remoteness, of basically a huge process of deglobalization. Thank you.
Wow, what a journey. I remember when I was early teenage, I used to read Jules Verne, Around the World in 80 Days. It took me a few years to understand the colonial lenses of Jules Verne, but I think I did the wrong thing. I should have done archaeology in an hour with Alfredo González Rubial. So, dear Alfredo, thank you very, very much for sharing your reforming ideas about globalization and deglobalization. And thank you for sharing different ways of how we can engage with material and non-material traces from the past to actually change the current example and putting at the center what has been on the periphery for so long. Thank you for the journey. Thank you for the ideas. And more importantly, thank you for helping us to continue the conversation after your talk at the McDonald Institute at the reception. Muchas gracias, Alfredo.